Hi, I'm U.S. Election Assistance Commission Chairman Don Palmer. Today, as we continue our 2020 Lessons Learned video series, I'm privileged to be joined by Don Gray. Don has been serving as a Sangamon County, Illinois County Clerk since 2015 and previously served as the Chief Deputy Assessor for Sangamon County. He also serves on our EAC Board of Advisors. Thank you, Don, for joining me today. Thank you for agreeing to do this.
It's my pleasure, Chairman. Anytime we can get more word out about how we operate election administration, we know we're going to have a much more confident electorate out there. So my pleasure to be here.
Thank you. And let's talk a little bit about Sangamon County in Illinois and how the pandemic impacted the voting process in Illinois. Obviously, it impacted the country, different states differently, but let's talk a little bit about your county and how the pandemic impacted your voting experience and what were the major changes that took place in Sangamon County.
Absolutely. Just to give a little bit of perspective, Sangamon County is in central Illinois. It is God's country. We have the state capital, the seat of Springfield, Illinois, which is our capital here in Illinois. And we would be considered a medium-sized county. We've got about 140,000 registered voters. It's probably the population base of central Illinois. So we share, much more in kind of notoriety and providing services for a greater concentration of voters that you would find in our midsection of the state. So it's a wonderful county, and I'm happy to represent it. And really, the challenges, it was an interesting time, and I know it was an interesting time for all election administrators. I think the biggest challenge was really just the uncertainty that COVID presented us. And for us in Illinois, relative to our primary election, the pandemic itself took national attention just upon our primary. We had known something was happening. We have a March primary. We had known that COVID-19 was an international issue. It was finding its way to its borders here in the United States. And by the time we got closer to our March primary, we were really within weeks of kind of the critical moments of states contemplating shutdown. And that's exactly what Illinois was in. So it was a very uncertain period of being kind of waiting and in the wait to really, can we execute all of what we've prepared and put in place? And most challenging was, the evolution of the voter services. We had a lot more voters that were contemplating casting ballots differently than what they would normally traditionally do. We're usually voters of habit. If you're accustomed to voting in person, you don't normally think about doing a pre-election cast of ballots. So for us, it was a very high number of people now that were contemplating and executing the vote by mail process. And that certainly brought its new complexities of things that we needed to focus on to make sure that it was properly done, that we were executing our validation of the entitlement for them to be able to receive their ballot, that we were expeditiously acquiring, their vote by mail packet along with their ballot, that we had sufficient trained staff to do our part of validating signature checks, and doing more tabulation of ballots internally. So that was really, for us in the primary perspective, the most challenging part. Election day for the primary election, the challenge was how do we provide for a safe, secure, and procedurally appropriate polling location while keeping the health of individual voters at the forefront of our mind. So we were working closely with local health professionals, certainly listening to the advice of the CDC and other state departments of health, and putting together protocols that made most sense to keep voters safe and healthy, and that we weren't adding to the problem of the spread of COVID-19. So it's all those things that we've come to know as common now, articulating how important it was to wear a mask in the polling place, making sure that we had sanitation procedures in place, that every surface that voters and election workers came into contact had a routine way of being sanitized throughout election day. Properly social distancing our materials. You know, a lot of our polling locations are older buildings. You know, it's churches, it's schools, you know, it's older civic buildings that, you know, are a little bit more compact in size. So when the key is to spread out more, that provides the challenges. You know, we wanted to make sure that our voters, you know, had an expedited, healthy manner in which casting ballots. And we spent a lot of time digging into that and providing confidence to our voters that you can get out safely and cast ballots in person. And if you have any reservations to that, to execute, you know, the early voting process, where you can vote on your own time and kind of look at what the crowds look like internally to our office, you were able to monitor that in real time, or consider casting your ballot by mail.
So you mentioned identifying polling places. Did you have any problem recruiting poll workers or finding adequate polling places in the end?
So we've got 80 polling locations in Sangamon County. You know, I would say that about 20 of them were kind of in the critical factor of not being able to be used as a polling location. They were more focused in kind of senior living facilities, or they had a more senior population base. So we had to scramble quickly to think differently where we could go. And we worked really close, you know, with, you know, community stakeholders, with our Department of Public Health, to kind of identify what made most sense in, you know, just concrete structure or structures for us to have a polling location in these areas. And we found good success in being able to do that. Poll workers themselves, boy, that certainly was quite the challenge in the primary election. We certainly learned a lot from the primary election that we put into the field for the general election, where we didn't have as much trouble. But Sangamon County had and we used to have a much older populace of election worker that would routinely always serve as an election judge. And, you know, again, we were in that demographic zone of age where COVID could be most dangerous for them. So we had a lot of turnover. And it required us to have to think differently about a new generation of election worker and how we could articulate the opportunity and how we could properly train them to provide for the service. In the primary election, because we were about 10 days out from it really becoming a critical issue for us in Illinois, we had a substantial amount of turnover. We put on the field about 540 election judges in a primary election over our 180 precincts. And I would say half of them, we had to elicit and bring in a new person. What did we do? We started to articulate to a younger generation of helping us to step up to civic responsibility. A lot of social media articulation and marketing. We worked closely with schools, with our superintendent of schools here locally, to get word out to a younger generation of teachers and to students that would be interested in serving. We worked closely with our state associations here in the state capitol to articulate that same messaging from state workers that wouldn't be working. And we were targeting a younger generation of election worker. And it worked. And I'm proud to say that our constituency here in Sangamon County stepped up, heeded the call, and understood the importance of the election and how proper administration is executed at the local level, precinct level, by election judges that are critical ingredient of the day. And we were able to get the job done. For us in Illinois, it's a partisan function. You know, we have to have the proper balance between the two parties. We worked closely with both parties, informing them and letting them know where we may be deficient and where we needed to have more help. And they jumped in as well and really helped recruit a whole new generation of election judges for us to train and put to the field. So in the grand scheme of things, it worked out really well, and we got the job done. And today we benefit from that effort, and we continue that effort to market a new generation of election judge so that we're fully equipped for any election of the future.
So that's outstanding. Let's talk a little bit about early in-person voting. You mentioned that. How was that different this year?
Right. So, in the 2020 presidential cycle, there was an evolution of how folks were casting ballots. Our final analysis showed that really half of our ballots cast, it was about 106,000 ballots cast total. Half of those ballots cast were cast in advance of Election Day. And of those cast in advance of Election Day, it was substantially more mail than it was early voting. There were roughly about 36,000 ballots cast by mail and about 20,000 ballots cast in office early voting. So this was interesting. We had never seen those types of numbers before from the mail opportunity to cast ballots. That was a clear change for us, and it required us to really revamp and think deeply internally to how we are administering the mail program. It took substantially more internal staff to accept applications. In Illinois, you have to application your request for a ballot by mail. We certainly do our internal controls to ensure that you're entitled and properly registered. Then we prepare the packet for delivery of mail. And then it comes back to us, and a team of election judges then authenticate and validate the signature on file to the certification envelope and the system. And then, of course, we accept the ballot, initial the ballot to activate and tabulate. We need a lot more people to do that with 36,000 when we're used to doing somewhere between 5,000 to 6,000. So the challenge was recruitment of judges to perform this function. We looked to our best that we found that we've had before in the past in Election Day operations and brought them into the fold to be trained on how to process vote by mail. And we had a team of 16 every day at the start of early vote that came in at a set time and started processing the vote by mail. And we were able to keep up on a daily basis with the flow that was coming in. The part that I found comforting and interesting about the vote by mail process is that those that were voting by mail also were keenly interested in ensuring that their ballot by mail was received and cast. So we knew we had to go and elicit some sort of form of real-time tracking ballots so that they could have real-time information to the status of their ballot. And if we weren't properly bringing in staff levels to process, and there was a lag between the voter dropping off their ballot and it being accepted in the system, that could potentially cause problems of people feeling uncomfortable, like something was wrong, even though we know it's just trying to keep up with the load. So we wanted to provide more. We wanted to do it more expeditious to when voters were bringing back ballots, and that really helped a lot in keeping phone calls down of questions of any anxiety or doubts about the proper administration of vote by mail ballots. Some form of tracking system that you could see real time online. Certainly you could call us. We were sending text messages and email messages to those that had emails and cell numbers on their voter file to tell them in real time where their ballot was at and what status. It also helped us in mitigating problem returned vote by mail ballots, not proper signatures or signatures that were denied that didn't match, not all the elements of the certification envelope filled out, or no ballot in the certification envelope at all. Those things all happen. Promptly jumping on those problems went a long way too of smoothly executing vote by mail on a daily basis, so that in our final tabulated result, that there was great confidence of the public that it was done right. So those things were certainly challenged. It's now brought us a brand new modern world for us in election administration in Sangamon County going forward. And we continue just to add more elements to that. And I think we've got a bright future in the opportunities that makes most sense for however the voter wants to be able to cast their ballot, if it's vote by mail, early voting, or on election day.
So on the vote by mail, the absentee voting, you mentioned a number of voters would return those ballots. Did you, how would you break down the folks that use the post office versus, you mentioned delivery to your office? Did you have drop boxes in Illinois, or were there other methods of returning it? And what did, you know, if you know the statistics, or generally, how did Sangamon County, you know, voters return their ballots generally if they had requested it?
Yeah, our state legislature and governor passed some resources like that in a quick elections bill for us to be more flexible and equipped with other routes relative to vote by mail. And drop boxes were one of those resources that we could invest in. Sangamon County did make that investment in the drop boxes. We had two. We had one right here at the election authority at our county facility. And we had a second at another location of county property. Now, they were a tremendous administrative success and asset to us here in Sangamon County. Almost 80% of the ballots returned by mail that we had put to the field for this election came back through the drop boxes.
Wow.
And how it was so helpful to us was that we were receiving it so much faster than what we would have through the United States Postal Service. It allowed us to even stay more out in front of the internal processing of the vote by mail and informing those that did vote by mail to where they were at in the process of their ballot. So it was a huge asset administratively for us internally. We didn't have any problems with the United States Postal Service. It was just nicer to get them earlier. But we did go this framework because the Postal Service did articulate to Illinois that their delivery standards were in conflict to Illinois' law to the return of vote by mail. They were articulating a much more lengthier delivery time of mail, and Illinois is quite progressive in allowing the opportunity of a return of vote by mail, that you had up to 5 days in advance of the election to even make a request. And we knew that there could be a gap between the delivery standards of the Postal Service and a ballot returning back. And we wanted all ballots back, and we wanted all ballots to be counted. So we made the investment in the drop boxes. It was a huge success for the public. A big part of going that way was, again, providing confidence to our voters. And how do we do that? We made sure that we invested ourselves in a heavy duty, professional, a well-tested drop box from the West Coast that's been doing it more often than we have here in Illinois in advance of us. So an experienced company. It was weatherproof, it was tamper-proof, and we took the approach to make sure that we had monitoring on that box 24 hours a day, so that there were no doubts to any type of activity associated with that box. An important part to confidence to the procedures that it was being done properly was how we were retrieving ballots from the drop box. We took the premise, like we do with the processing of vote by mail and processing of voters in a polling place. We provided for a partisan breakdown of personnel that did nothing but retrieve ballots from the drop boxes on a routine time frame throughout the day. We had logs where you had to be accountable. Both individuals had to count the total number of ballots and agree. The log had to represent the number of ballots coming back and returned to the election authority. An internal staff professional in our election office would validate the number coming back. They would count them and validate to the log. So that also was a real important part of ensuring that was done properly and that we had that transparency and accountability to the process. So I believe that Dropbox is now a permanent fixture in Illinois in our most recent cycle of legislative action. They've been authorized for use of the future. It's still at a discretionary position for the authority, but we'll continue to use them because it was just a great administrative asset, and we'll continue to protect and make sure that's done right. I was a skeptic from the beginning to start because of the potentiality of the ballot harvesting scenario that we had seen in other states, but we know we're keeping it accountable and properly monitored, so that we would never allow that type of function to creep into our local election administration here in Sangamon County.
So let's pivot a little bit to election day. You talked a little bit already about some of the safety precautions for people that want to vote in person.
Yeah.
Did you, obviously, this is just one more thing that you had to face on election day. Were there any issues with voter registration or provisional ballots or checking in or technical issues on election day? And just generally, how did election day go for you?
Yeah, it went fantastic. We had a very good election day. It certainly was, less numbers than we would normally see in a polling place, and that was by design. When a little more than half of our ballots are being cast in advance, and that's what this authority was articulating, that part of ensuring that people are maintaining safe and being healthy is to seriously contemplate the other forms of being able to cast ballots, because it will reduce, crowds and the potentiality of longer time in polling place by doing so. And the public responded to that in the right demographics of those that were most affected of the potentiality of COVID infection. So we saw, a more middle-aged to younger age turnout of election voters. We found it to be more rural than it was in urban. So in more of the spread out populace of our rural areas of Sangamon County were voting. So that also kind of kept down the potentiality of, close exposure. And we worked, closely to ensure that we were properly spaced out, that all the proper gear was being worn by election personnel and voters alike. We even went to one-use materials of what we could from the pens. Every voter came in, instead of an "I voted" sticker this time, you got a pen to be able to cast your ballot as a souvenir and take home. We did the same with our privacy sleeves. So we put into place all the recommended procedures and supplies that our health professionals said to use. And it worked out perfectly. We had very little lines. It went very smoothly. We didn't have technical problems with voting equipment or personnel. You mentioned the voter registration in Illinois. We do have same-day voter registration in polling place. We were very proactive in the maintenance of our voter registration data, making sure that those that weren't properly registered or suspended or hadn't been registered yet knew what their options were, and to do it in advance of election day. It just leads to a smoother, healthier day. You're not spending time registering to in polling place. We also opened up the opportunity to be able to register here at the authority and cast the ballot. If you weren't registered already, keeps that form of voter out of the polling location into the election authority, where only those who aren't registered could cast ballots. So those that are duly registered had to go to polling place. So we were trying to segregate those out of the system to come to us here, in a more safe environment. In the mix between all of that, it worked, and we did not find our election day to be any form of super spreader of COVID, and everyone walked away in a very healthy place. And we spent a lot of time articulating what it is that we're doing for the public, and the public listened to it and responded to it, and it certainly worked.
Well, this is great to hear. One of the things I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you about is, for a long time, at least in the run-up during the primary and the general election, many of the mailing routes were closed overseas. And I'd like to hear how you dealt with this issue with your uniform and overseas civilian voters. And did the pandemic impact that community, and were you able to serve those voters in the end?
We saw very little changes in Uocava in the overseas, civilians and military ballots. We don't have a very large registered constituency of that. Where we just don't see normally a lot of it. We're kind of in the hundreds of ballots that would be affected by that. And we didn't see a whole lot that needed to be addressed differently in facilitating that program. It went really just fine for us, and didn't require us to have to do much more. And it was executed as they should expect and done well, and provided the opportunity, and ballots were cast.
So after 2020, I usually ask this question after every general election of election administrators. Are there things that you are sort of dedicated to sort of resolving and improving, lessons learned from this election as we move forward to 2022 and 2024?
I spent a lot of time now talking about the need to be much more disclosive and transparent to the public, being much more accommodating, spending time educating. I think that's the future of the confidence of our electoral process. So, I'm working closely with our legislature to, provide for more elements of routine audits. And we're not talking about just audits of ballots cast and the outcome and the accuracy of our tabulation system. Audits now of kind of administrative functions of voter services, such as vote by mail, ensuring that election authorities have a clear line of all the necessary applications, the ballots themselves, the certification envelopes, all of the pieces that are required of us to validate before ballots would be accepted as a piece of vote by mail is being part of an audit now too. That the materials have to be maintained. They have to be maintained in a certain way. They have to be reviewable, that we review them in a certain way, looking at a percentage of them and making sure that it was done appropriate. Learning from that process just of strictly administrative and validation of voter things. I think that's going to go a long way of the future of what we're doing in elections in the manner in which ballots are cast. And you can translate those audits from the application process internally for early voting, the same as the signature reviews, any of the elements that are most important to us that hold the system accountable, and being more routine, showing those results to the public, and educating as the election authority, making it a priority of getting out in the public in advance of elections and talking about how we operate and why we do what we do and how we do it, so that there's not misinformation or misunderstandings about how elections are operated and administered, especially since we're a decentralized system throughout the United States, that each state independently operates how they perform their elections. For a long period now, post 2020's general election, things that are happening in other states that are not allowable by law in Illinois, or that we've contemplated or have experience levels with here in Illinois for a long time, where we do things differently, are under review from hearing stories from other states. So I think we've got to start to talk more amongst ourselves as election administrators nationally, like we do through here in the EAC and the Board of Advisors, and come up with more common, practical things to provide confidence in tabulation, in administration, in voting equipment and tabulation, that I know that we do as a part of the good work of the EAC, and articulating that better to the public so that, everyone's more informed, now just power. And, I know that we're going to focus more here in Sangamon in doing that. We've got online tools of videos explaining all of our elements in administration. I routinely put things out over social media to come from a trusted source, such as the election authority and its elected county clerk. And that has gone a very long way in providing confidence of the public and educating and providing for a much more smooth and accountable and transparent electoral process. If election administrators were doing more of that, I know that there would be less angst and anxiety about what it is that we do, and more confidence of the public that the finalized result is what it is, because we know that it is.
That's a really good point and a really good recommendation. I think that there's been a lot of news about audits, what different types of audit, tabulation audits, obviously the forensic audits that can take place on voting machines. But a lot of folks don't know about the reconciliation and the canvassing of different, who's voted at the polling place and who's on the voter lists. Those are important things that if there's a way to be transparent about that and uniform, I think that's a really good recommendation. And I look forward to talking with you further about that.
Yeah, it's a critical part. It's kind of that old saying that says, your front end activity of data is going to dictate what comes out on the back end. And if we're being much more focused on the foundation of the electoral process, which is voter registration, ensuring that that's being done correctly up front, your outcomes on the back end of ballots cast and tabulated are going to be much more precise and accurate with less troubles of administration in between. So I do look forward to working closely and further with the EAC and other states and administrators to make that happen.
Thank you very much. Don Gray, Sangamon County, Illinois, thank you for joining us. Thank you for everything you did in the 2020 election. Give my best to your staff and your poll workers. And Bravo Zulu on 2020. And I look forward to working with you in the future.
Thank you so much. I had a wonderful time discussing it. And the more that we do this, the better we'll be. So thanks again for all you do and how the word gets out to the EAC.
Thank you, Don.